It's the dawn of a new console generation, one that's launched in uncertain times due to a myriad of factors. So it's nice that a nice warm comfort blanket of nostalgia like the Ratchet & Clank series can return to distract us from what's been going on lately. In just a few days after the posting of this video, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart will launch exclusively for the PlayStation 5, and unless something drastic happens between when I'm writing this and when the game comes out, I probably won't be playing it. It's not because I don't want to, but because PS5s are almost impossible to find by traditional means. If you don't want to pay inflated scalper prices and risk getting mugged in a sketchy Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace trade-off, then it's unlikely you have a PS5 in your home right now. PS5s right now are more valuable and harder to find than a lost civilization's treasure.
Give me the whip! Adios, senor.
Because of the anticipation for at the very least being able to watch the gorgeous cutscenes on YouTube the day after the game comes out, I've recently been going through the series again, which has brought me back to a controversial and the latest entry in the franchise, Ratchet & Clank 2016. Released in, 2016, this is the game based on the movie based on the game. As I'm sure everyone has forgotten by now, there was a Ratchet & Clank movie in theaters. So, to help sell movie tickets, Insomniac Games took a look back at their original 2002 classic and remade it from the ground up on PS4 using the modified story from the movie as the new game's script. While the game was a critical and commercial success, quickly becoming the best and quickest selling Ratchet game to date, longtime fans of the series were less enthused of this entry. At the time, I was completely taken with the game, really only complaining about the length of the game and praising pretty much every other aspect of it. But in the months that followed my original review, as I sought out the coveted Platinum Trophy, the cracks in the foundation really started to appear. While I don't hate the game by any stretch of the imagination, my opinion of the game quickly began to sour, and I started to rethink a lot of my points I'd made in the original review. In some places, the game was very authentic to the original, almost to its detriment, and an all-around sense of sameness began to ooze from the game as I continued to play. Then there were the changes, some of which did and didn't make sense. So once I put the game down in early 2017 after getting the Platinum Trophy, I didn't touch it or really any Ratchet game again until recently. Upon my newest playthrough of the original game from 2002, I noticed many little details from the original game that had carried over to the remake that had largely been left unmentioned in the conversations I had seen online, and some things that I thought were changes weren't really changes at all. So, once I completed my playthrough of the original trilogy again, I decided to take another look at Ratchet 2016 and question if it really earned some of the scorn it's gathered online. Also, after looking back at my original review for the game, I wanted to throw up due to its overall production quality, and decided that I could use an update itself. Just listen to this. Ew.
If I have one complaint about the game, it's that it feels a tad short. Well, that there's been a great deal added to the game, there are some things missing as well. The planets Eroda, Orxon, Haven, and Atlantis, all missing from the roster of planets.
So, let's head back to the Solana Galaxy once more as we take another look at Ratchet & Clank 2016. I'm going to save my overall in-depth look at the story for later, so we'll start off with the basic premise for now and go from there. The game stars Ratchet, an alien known as a Lombax. Ratchet was orphaned as a child and spends his days working as a mechanic in a garage, longing for the day where he can leave his home planet of Veldin. Under the noses of galactic authorities, Chairman Drek of the Blarg species has recently begun destroying planets so he can use the pieces left over to construct a new one for his species since the original planet is overpopulated and polluted. Since galactic authorities might take umbrage at the idea of destroying existing planets to build a new one, Drek commissions the evil Dr. Nefarious to build him a warbot army. One of these warbots comes off the assembly line defective, and upon learning of Drek's plan, escapes to Veldin where he meets Ratchet. The Lombax nicknames the robot Clank, and from there the two forge an alliance to stop Drek and Nefarious and save the galaxy. This begins the start of their adventure and one of the talking points about the game. In many ways, this game is very similar to the original game since it is a remake. Many returning levels and planets from the original are meticulously recreated, and it's really cool to walk around the familiar remade environments. Anyone intimately familiar with the original title should feel right at home here, as enemies attack in similar ways, the pathing remains the same, and cutscenes play out with similar results. For the most part, the level design of the original game has aged well, and it's represented here excellently. Jumping back and forth between both entries in a relatively short time frame, I was impressed at the level of detail Insomniac went to recreate each map. It's so faithful, in fact, that when a change does appear, it can be slightly jarring for seasoned fans of the series. For instance, several planets from the original are missing due to the shorter nature of the game overall and the rewritten story. However, the choice on what planets to eliminate from the roster doesn't seem to have been made willy-nilly, and those planets that are eliminated still feature some sort of thematic representation by elements of them being combined to areas that do make it into the final game. Take for instance the planet Umbris in the original. Umbris doesn't physically appear in the remake, instead being name-dropped and being the planet where the deplanetizer superweapon is positioned above at the climax of the game. So while the Umbris level from the original game doesn't appear in full, its level-ending boss battle does. The Blargian Snagglebeast boss from Umbrus in the original game is now placed at the end of the Nebula G34 level instead. Narratively, Nebula G34 serves a similar role as the original, with Ratchet and Clank traveling there to loot the place for secret Blarg weapons and gadgets, while obtaining intel to lead them forward in the story. This level also now adopts the Umbrus storyline as well as its ending boss battle. In the original game, intergalactic superhero Captain Quark has sold out to Chairman Drek and has been ordered to eliminate Ratchet and Clank from interfering with his plans. To stop them, Quark lures the duo to Umbrus, where a deadly obstacle course is waiting for them, and once they survive that, the Blargian Snagglebeast boss fight. In the remake, Nebula G34 now serves a similar purpose by having a jealous Quark lead them there to get rid of them so he can get his spotlight back. Waiting for them at the end of the level is the Blargian Snagglebeast, something Quark feigns surprise at.
Captain, did you know Drek's secret project was a Blargian Snagglebeast?
It is? I wonder why it wasn't in any of my intel. I was expecting something much less lethal.
The boss fight works as a better alternative to both the original Alien Queen boss from the original Nebula G34 and Umbrus fights, as the new boss is less of a pushover and has to be tricked into walking into lava as opposed to stupidly marching into it himself. The Blarg scientists even poke fun at the outdated enemy AI from the original game during the in-game dialogue.
Subject appears to have a fondness for falling into lava. Jim, let's boost the neurotransmitters and see if we can add a few IQ points to this dimwit.
The remake is filled with clever adaptations like this, as for almost every level they eliminated, they found a way to incorporate somehow, even if it was just visually. For instance, Hoven from the original doesn't appear in the remake. However, Hoven's icy exterior is placed over the formerly overgrown terrain on planet Batalia, and in both versions Ratchet and Clank managed to derail Drek's plans using turrets. Similarly, the Gimlick base level is absent, but the Quark space battle appears in the remake, now reskinned as Victor Von Ion's death ship. Both boss battles feature similar moves from the enemy ship being engaged, with the battle halted at certain parts by a tractor beam making Ratchet endure an onslaught of missiles. The planets Kortu and Orxon are now combined and completely redesigned, serving as both the Blarg homeworld and the place of Clank's creation, and also the site where the heroes learned about the Deplanetizer superweapon. And speaking of, Drek's fleet is now remade into the Deplanetizer interiors that Ratchet and Clank must sneak through late in the game using a holographic disguise, just like in the original. Gaspar is also greatly expanded on, now featuring an entire lava field to explore and collect trinkets to trade for upgrades and bolts, as well as featuring the layout of the original map. The final two boss battles even mirror the single final Drek boss from the original. Captain Quark will use similar attacks to Drek in his fight, summoning the Agents of Doom to fight Ratchet, while Dr. Nefarious utilizes a large hovering mech like Drek did, with one beam attack being similar to one of the Blarg leader's attacks. The logging planet of Eudora and the Clankless Gorda City level from the original game seem to be pretty much the only levels not to get some form of shout-out or reference to in the remake, but considering Gorda City is by far my least favorite level in that game, yeah, I'm not complaining that much. It's actually really cool to see how faithful the game remains to the original outside of just aesthetically. I think it shows that Insomniac really cared about making this game as good as it could be, and an upside to this is somewhat reviving the exploratory nature of the original game. Much talked about in the Ratchet community online and admitted by Insomniac themselves, Ratchet & Clank started out as a mascot platformer with shooter elements, and by the time of their third game release in 2004, had morphed into a shooter with platform elements. While Ratchet still has to run, jump, and swing around obstacles, most of these led the Lombax down a linear path. In both the original and its 2003 sequel Going Commando, the game levels would typically feature 2 or 3 branching paths per planet. One of them focused on combat, with the other focusing more on the platforming and exploration of the world. Upon arriving on a planet, players had a choice of destination. They could either run into an area guns blazing, or swing around and explore a bit, only encountering minimal resistance from enemies. As the series has continued on, the focus has been more and more on constant action, with 2009's A Crack in Time being one of the few titles over the years to put a prioritization on exploration and puzzle solving as well as action. So with the remake sticking so close to the original's design style, those extra paths to explore are still there and intact. Old fans probably won't have too many surprises to find, but it's nice to take a breather from combat every once in a while and just run away from a flooding tunnel instead of a flood of enemies. Visually, the game is also gorgeous. Being built on PS4 architecture means that the game is often stunning to look at. The wide, sprawling city vistas of Illyros City on Kurwan really recapture what the original PS2 version was going for and then some. Bronze-coated buildings, glistening windows, overgrown foliage in the places. The city looks alive and lived in, especially with traffic flying overhead. Joe Y Resort on Pokotaru has never boasted cleaner-looking waters either, and it looks like a place one would actually visit for a tropical vacation. The in-game animations of the enemies and Ratchet's movements are also very fluid. The enemy design retains the more cartoonish behavior of the original PS2 models while boasting the more realistic detailing of the PS3's Ratchet & Clank Future Trilogy. Not to get too technical while nerding out over the animation, but Ratchet also features blink and you'll miss it squash and stretch techniques while jumping, helping to add to the tangible feel of the character models. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for the in-game cutscenes. The in-game cutscenes that appear during gameplay are weirdly static and stiff. Shots will bounce back and forth between Ratchet and Clank and whoever they're speaking to with very little movement. Mouths will flap and the characters will kinda bob up and down in idle animations, but the expressions on the characters' faces won't change often, which makes some moments a little more than awkward. These types of conversations wouldn't feel out of place in an open-world RPG, considering the vast amount of side quests needed, that it'd be impossible for nearly every side conversation and cutscene to be animated, but even the more active cutscenes are a little stiff. At the very least, the cutscenes taken straight from the movie look good, but we'll talk about that in a bit. For now, let's talk weapon selection. Since the series started back in 2002, Ratchet & Clank has been known for its wide array of crazy and unique weapons. Plenty of those same weapons can be found in this game, and that's one of the detractors about it. For someone jumping into the series for the first time, or for the first time in a long time, the weapons should feel fairly fresh and unique. For longtime fans of the franchise, however, most of the arsenal you have access to is a little stale. Many of the weapons that exist in the game have featured in at the very least one previous entry, with only the Proton Drum and Pixelizer being unique to this title. Most of the returning weapons were featured in the previous PS3 era games from 2007 onward, with no returning weapons from the original PS2 Ratchet being available except for the Glove of Doom. And I guess the Pyroster is a technicality, but it uses the Pyroblaster skin from Tools of Destruction onward while keeping the name of the flamethrower in the original, but I suppose if you used one flamethrower, you've probably used them all. While old favorites such as the Groovatron and Mr. Zircon are always a blast to use, the Combustor, Predator Launcher, and Buzzblades were more than a little played out by the time the remake came out in 2016. For many, it did seem as if Insomniac had run out of fresh ideas for weapons, but I personally think they are more or less restricted based on what the movie was able to utilize and so couldn't go completely off the rails bonkers in terms of weapons like usual. Based on what I've seen from Rift Apart, it seems like new and unique weapons will be returning, so I'm not that concerned about the quality of Ratchet's arsenal in the long run. However, for this game, if you are a longtime fan, expect a lot of familiar feeling weapons and upgrades. I suppose one way to look at it as well is that the large reuse of weapons was also done to help celebrate Ratchet & Clank's history. I mean, is the Warmonger really all that different from the Devastator in the original? I already made that same point for the Pyroceter. There's only so much you can do with certain weapon types, so maybe the weapon selection was a best of collection to go with the reworked and reimagined levels. This is an issue I can easily see both sides of, and I'm not quite sure where I land. I certainly don't think of any of the weapons as useless, but I'm not wowed by them either. It's a little bit of been there, done that, but I'm not sure it's fair to praise the game for remaining faithful in one aspect and then criticizing it for doing the same in another. So I suppose the weapons in the game are a bit of a moot point for me. I'll leave that one up to you guys to decide your verdict on. Aside from the typical shooting, there are a few various different side levels to spice up typical gameplay.
It's that time again, the annual Blackwater City Hoverboard Competition on planet Rilgar. Are you a young thrill seeker looking to show off your hoverboard skills? Then blast on over to Rilgar and experience the pulse-pounding thrill of doing Mach 3 on a rocket-powered piece of plastic.
Hoverboard races returned from the original. The only difference is that they're fun to play this time around. The occasional spaceship dogfight also appears, but I wish they didn't because they control horribly. For whatever reason, ship combat is something that Ratchet games can just never get right, as 2009's A Crack in Time is really the only game that has fun ship moments for me. Clank also gets his own playable sections where he controls gadgetbots to solve puzzles. These are fun for the most part, aside from the portions where Clank must escape Victor Von Ion. These are painfully slow to control, opting for a Crash Bandicoot-style run towards the moving camera section as opposed to the regular Clank gameplay. Worse yet, the second of these two sections is on the stupidly tiny Starship Phoenix model from Full Frontal Assault, which is fine for that game, but now Clank and Victor play Ring Around the Rosie and circle through the interior multiple times. Other than that, Clank gameplay is fine, but nothing to write home about. Going back to the idea that celebrating the series' legacy was part of the point behind the game, and in a lot of ways, I have to agree. While it is a reboot, it does a lot of typical reboot things and takes a lot of inspiration from the series as a whole and not just the original game. One of the ways it pays tribute to the series as a whole is the trading card system, which is actually kind of a fun background minigame collectible thing. Ratchet will find trading cards throughout the game, or dead enemies will drop them, and collections can be added up to improve the percentage of bolt pickups or ammo pickups or unlock stronger weapons in challenge mode. Each card features a character, location, or weapon and the information that goes with them. So a player new to the franchise can learn a little bit about it without totally being drowned in lore or be forced to read the Ratchet & Clank wiki. For veterans of the franchise, it's fun to see old characters and weapons pop up from time to time. Another area of the game I'm very mixed on is the music. From the start of the series, Ratchet & Clank has always had great music, but it's evolved a lot over time. Back in the PS2 days, background music was more worried about entertaining the player and with fitting an environment than telling a story. Starting with the PS3 games, the soundtracks have shifted more towards the style of feature film scores, focusing on assisting the storytelling. This means that many of the memorably melodical tracks found in the original games are no more, now replaced with soundtracks that more or less blend into the background. For many Ratchet fans, this has been a big point of contention and a large knock against this specific game. I think if the original games hadn't had such great soundtracks, then it wouldn't be such a big issue, but the original games did have great soundtracks. Just listen to these for a moment. They're catchy, they fit the environment they belong to, and they're also short enough that they can be played repeatedly in a loop. The music in the reboot is not bad at all, but it is a distinctly different style compared to the originals. The newer music is mainly, to my ears, a series of various melodies that is then interspersed with the main Ratchet & Clank hero theme, similar to a Hollywood musical score. No one planet or location really has a concrete theme like in the original, focusing more on settling into the background until the main hero theme comes back in full force when Ratchet blows up a bunch of dudes. I could be wrong on all of this, so if someone that's actually musically trained wants to tell me off in the comments for how stupid I am, please do so. I like the work that Michael Bross has done on the number of Ratchet games he's composed for. He's done a pretty good job, and I think it suits what each game has gone for. It's just sadly not as memorable as the original game's music. Unfortunately, in a long-running series like this, not everyone is going to be on board for every evolution that comes its way, and the evolution of the music is one of those sticking points for fans. In terms of not reusing the original themes or soundtrack from the original, I can't remember where I saw this posted, and haven't even been able to track it down since, so I apologize if this is just spreading misinformation, but I read somewhere that the original soundtracks composed by David Bergaud are copyrighted in such a way that they can only be used in the games that they were made for, which includes remasters but excludes remakes. So if that's true and I'm not misremembering something or believing hearsay I saw on the internet years ago, then it'd be impossible to reuse the original game's soundtracks for the remake. So that's what I'm going with for now, and I mean, the internet can always be trusted, right?
Bernie, you can't believe everything you read on the internet. That's how World War I got started.
So far, I've been fairly positive talking about this game, not liking every little thing it has to offer, but able to come to terms with them. However, now we get to the crux of the matter on why this game isn't liked that well by the older Ratchet & Clank fanbase. There are many who believe that this game is a perfect example for how Ratchet & Clank is a shell of its former self, saying the soul of the franchise has disappeared. To a certain point I agree, and that really comes down to the story and tone. The story in this game is a mess, damaging the characters and the tone that the original strived for. However, I don't really fault the game for being like this. It can't help it. It could only do with what it was given, and what it was given in terms of story wasn't much. So, now it's time to rip off the Band-Aid. In order to properly look at the story, we must first take a look at the movie it's based on.
Oh, that was terrible.
And, yeah, it's not great. What's worse is that the movie isn't 100% terrible either. If it was, it would be easier to just forget it exists. But it's animated well enough and does enough things right that I can see a reality where the movie was good. In some ways, it was so close and yet so far. For instance, Captain Quark is written pretty well, and his character arc in the film is arguably stronger than it is in the original PS2 trilogy. Quark's story in those games suffers a bit from making it up as they went along-itis. So by the time he gets his redemption story in the third game, it works, but only just so. There were a few too many genuinely evil chuckles in the original game for me to totally buy his switch in 3. Thankfully, the movie carefully manages to toe the line between Quark's selfish nature and his heroic, caring side. Naturally, he gives into his selfish side for a bit, but he only does so while thinking that no one was going to get hurt in the process, making it easier to buy his turnaround again at the end of the game. In the original, I'd easily buy the idea of Quark just axing off anyone who got in his way so he could retain his sponsorship deal with Drek. That's what he tries to do to Ratchet & Clank on several occasions, his incompetence just leading to his downfall and Ratchet's success. Several plot details and ideas are pretty good as well and are good adaptations from the games. For instance, Dr. Nefarious serves as the real villain of the film by betraying Drek, motivated by revenge for the way he was treated by Quark while working for the Galactic Rangers. Many have wondered why Nefarious was even featured in the film considering the robotic supervillain didn't show up until the third game in the series, but I think it makes perfect sense for him to be included. Obviously, in today's movie industry, very few films are probably conceived of as one-offs. Everyone is looking for the next big franchise. So if Sony wanted to take Ratchet & Clank from a popular video game series and turn it into a popular film series as well, then it makes sense to look at the wider picture when crafting what you hope will be the first of many movies. So, by showcasing Nefarious' transformation into a robotic villain at the end of the game, you can set him up to be the more obvious villain in the third movie without having to hide in Drek's shadow. The same goes for the introduction of the Galactic Rangers as a concept, which, like Nefarious, were absent in the first two titles and not appearing until Up Your Arsenal. The adaptation and use of the weapons and gadgets was also well done, with the Ranger suits allowing them to teleport weapons into battle, explaining the weapon wheel mechanic from the games. And as discussed earlier, there's a pretty wide selection of weapons from the game showcased in the film. So while older fans can point and smile at some of their old favorites, newcomers can appreciate some of the zaniness the series has to offer for the first time. The only problem with that path of logic, though, is that it would have required people to go see the movie, and they didn't. With a purported budget of just $20 million, it only made $14 million at the box office, and it's not hard to see why. One of the biggest problems with the movie is found in the title characters themselves. While Clank is pretty spot on, Ratchet is written very weirdly. I understand wanting to write Ratchet differently than his original characterization because to say original Ratchet has a bit of an attitude problem would be an understatement. Original Ratchet was a selfish bratty teen that didn't want anything to do with adventures or heroics unless it netted him new weapons and gadgets. He didn't really care about Clank's quest to save the galaxy at all until Quark betrayed them and then it was just about revenge. Only near the end of the game did he care enough to stop Drek from destroying half the galaxy. And even then, it essentially took Drek threatening his homeworld to get him to care, making it personal. This led to several clashes between the title duo, making their early relationship abrasive.
Look, we'll go just long enough to pick up the O2 mask.
Perhaps the extra oxygen will help your brain to function properly.
Yeah, and maybe the salt water will rust your mouth shut.
So I can understand wanting to write Ratchet differently this time around, especially since now that James Arnold Taylor would be getting a crack at the origin story. James Arnold Taylor was brought on to voice Ratchet from the second game onward as part of Insomniac's shift to help make Ratchet a more likable character. Unfortunately, the film goes hard in the opposite direction of Ratchet, making him just as annoying as originally, but without any of the qualities that actually made him a well-defined character. Now, movie Ratchet is a wide-eyed thrill-seeker that's eager to jump into adventure and to meet his hero, Captain Quark. And he's incredibly nice. Too nice. When Ratchet and Clank meet for the first time, they immediately become friends, and that's that. I don't even think that the scene where they meet is badly written, it's just that there's nothing after it to help solidify their relationship. There's one moment where they realize they have something in common, essentially both being orphans, but after that there's no disagreements between them, no further character exploration about what makes either of them tick, or why they should remain friends after the galaxy is saved. As annoying as it might have been to constantly watch Ratchet and Clank bicker back and forth in the original, at least by the end of the game, both of them had come to a better understanding of the other and had formed a genuine friendship through mutual trials and experiences. So, when Clank shows up on Velden at the end, there's no fuzzy feeling that our favorite duo is back together ready for whatever adventure comes their way like in the original. Now I'm left wondering why these two are friends at all. And what's more annoying is that I can easily see a route they could have taken to help solidify that relationship based on what's present in the actual film. Another case of so close yet so far. While having Ratchet be an eager thrill seeker is maybe a little cliche at this point, it could have worked and given him friction with Clank. The film clearly wants to make it seem like Captain Quark's influence is a negative one, but it's not played up nearly enough. If Ratchet had become incredibly vain while under Quark's wing, there could have been a great scene, similar to one that's present in the actual film but executed horribly, where Clank states that fame is overrated and Quark is a bad influence on Ratchet. The young Lombax could then dismiss Clank's warning and say he trusts Quark implicitly. Again, that's not really anything too different from what the film is already trying to do, it's just doing it very poorly. So cut to later when Quark switches sides, the betrayal hurts all the more because Clank was right. Meanwhile, while Clank is a better character than Ratchet, he's still a little stale. Original Clank was fresh out of the robot factory like movie Clank, but he had a tangible goal and want to do the right thing. This is why he and Ratchet butted heads so often, because Clank was trying to be Ratchet's moral compass, but the Lombax was often too busy thinking of himself. Remove that conflict between the duo, and Movie Clank has less of a presence and an impact on the overall story aside from his early warning about Drek's intentions. He could mostly be cut out of the majority of the film afterward, and the plot wouldn't change at all. So again, looking at what's presented in the film, there's a rivalry between sorta new character Victor Von Ion, I think he's supposed to be the robotic lieutenant from Eudora, and Clank. Clank ends up dispatching Victor at the end of the second act, but it doesn't feel like a big moment at all, it just sorta comes and goes. This could have easily been a learning experience for the robot. Since he's so fresh off the assembly line, what if he was too focused on plans and detailed strategies? There's a weird subplot involving the Rangers being too shoot first, ask questions later-y, ignoring their in-house strategist Alaris, so instead of giving this subplot to a side character, what if one of the main characters had it? While it's true that the Rangers might be too gung-ho and need to be a little more strategic, no plan survives contact with the enemy. So defeating Victor could be the perfect way for Clank to learn this, and that sometimes improvisation is important, something he learns from the more carefree Ratchet. So, after the destruction of Novalis, the two can come together and apologize, each saying that they've learned something from the other, and that together they stand a better chance of defeating Drek. This would better solidify their friendship and make the moment where they decide to stick together after the galaxy is saved more poignant. And it would also help further flesh out Quark's story, since with the two together, he can finally see the error of his ways and how he wronged Nefarious, their stories running parallel. Only for the Mad Doctor, it's too late, forcing the ending in the film and his inevitable transformation into an organic-hating robot. And it's frustrating, because when you look at the film we got, the correct ingredients were there. The story on paper isn't bad at all. In some ways, it's even an improvement over the original game, but the seemingly rushed way it's put together makes for an unfortunately really forgettable experience. It's been documented in a couple places that the film underwent various rewrites, and that perhaps the final script is one that no one on the writing team was satisfied with, but they were out of time and had to press forward, and I think it shows, especially in the really questionable editing choices in a few places. There are several scenes in this movie that work really well on their own and speak pretty well to the characters it's trying to adapt, but when compared to the whole thing, these scenes seem obviously out of place and from a better version of the script. Even worse is how the voice cast is treated. The main stars of the film, Ratchet, Clank, Quark, are some of the last to be credited, with the big name talent instead being credited first. Paul Giamatti, Bella Thorne, Rosario Dawson, and John Goodman are all credited before James Arnold Taylor, David Kaye, or Jim Ward. I know that these are voice actors that aren't as well known as the obvious big name celebrities, but the actors playing the title characters aren't credited until near the end of the credit roll. And the movie doesn't build them up either, like they're saving the best for last. It just spits out their names like, oh yeah, they're in this too. That's honestly what made me the maddest about the whole thing. So, all in all, the film was a jumbled mess, and this has some really big ramifications on the game. For instance, Ratchet and Clank themselves aren't any better written than in the movie, with the game mostly relying on the movie clips to tell the story and build their characters up. But, as we just discussed, the movie doesn't do a good job of doing that, so neither does the game. In some ways, it does an even worse job, as the movie clips used are very selective and trimmed down, so sometimes the entire point behind a scene can be partially trimmed away. For the in-game cutscenes, most of the dialogue revolves around quid pro quo and not much else. On the rare occasion there will be an attempt at a joke, but these don't often land due to the lack of animation on the character models, instead making them come off as awkward. The really so-so story hurts the pacing of the game as well, as it just kind of ends without much of a triumphant note. In most previous mainline Ratchet games, reaching the final boss is an event, and is followed by a satisfying lean back in my chair sigh moment as I've been on the edge of my seat dodging attacks for a long while. This is partially due to the proper build-up of story and cutscenes, getting you ready for the exciting climax of the story. Instead, in this game, the final bosses more or less happen with little build-up, not even the music helping to invigorate you as you battle to save the universe. And the final bosses aren't bad either. I actually really enjoy them, even if they aren't the most difficult boss battles Insomniac has ever cranked out. Quark has a few surprises up his sleeve by utilizing a Groovatron against you, forcing Ratchet to dance uncontrollably and restricting your movements, and the verticality of the Dr. Nefarious mech boss battle adds a unique layer to it, straying away from the traditional grounded fights of the past. But these fights come up so quick and the story material doesn't get you that excited to play through them. The in-game writing also takes a bit of a dip in quality by the third act. While the writing hadn't always been the best throughout, the continuity had held up pretty well, but there's several things near the end that make me scratch my head. For instance, by the time the final level starts going, Dr. Nefarious betrayed Drek and turned him into a sheep, jettisoning him into space off the planetizer. So with Drek gone, he should be absent from the game, right? Well, as Ratchet and Clank infiltrate the superweapon, there's a few announcements from Drek over the intercom system as if he's still on board. I suppose it's possible that these are pre-recorded messages for security purposes, but it breaks my immersion to have to stop to think about it. And that brings up another thing. Weirdly enough, Drek doesn't ever appear in the game. He's visible in movie clips, one of them even being a deleted scene from the movie, but he never physically appears in the game during gameplay or in the in-engine cutscenes. He only ever appears via voice lines over radio chatter, with the closest being 2 statues of him on the Planetizer. Since his boss battle from the original is now divided in half and given to Quark and Nefarious, I suppose it makes sense that an Insomniac wouldn't need to create a character model for him, but I don't know. It feels a little weird to realize that one of the main villains of the game isn't technically in it. So with the game completed, the player unlocks challenge mode, bringing up another odd fact about the game. It only has 1 save slot? A little weird if you ask me, given that even all the way back on the PS2 Ratchet games, they easily had multiple save slots. But starting challenge mode or starting from scratch erases all save data if you don't back it up to the PSN first. Maybe Insomniac looked at data and realized hardly anyone ever uses multiple save slots or something, but I don't know. Kinda struck me as weird. And with challenge mode available, unless you want to go for the moderately easy platinum trophy, there's not really much reason to replay the game. Unlike most previous Ratchet games, the Insomniac Museum is unlocked after beating the main story once, instead of getting all the gold bolts or setting your PlayStation's internal clock to 2 in the morning while standing on a random teleporter, and the stuff that's in it is fine. A couple cool little secrets, but nothing on the level of most previous Insomniac museums. Usually the charming characters and story are reason enough alone to replay a Ratchet game to fully upgrade weapons and at least try to 100% it, but the lacking story really makes this an easy one and done experience, and part of that has to do with the tone as well. And so, here we are, finally talking about what is arguably the big sticking point of the game and why people don't like it. There's been numerous videos posted about the evolution of Ratchet & Clank over the years, and one of the things that most older fans point to is a shift away from the satirical commentary in the writing and comedy and more towards lore building and cheap gags. While I disagree with many that this has slowly ruined Ratchet as a series over time, I do understand where they're coming from and why the writing in this game can maybe put them off. The early Ratchet games have a very cynical edge to them, with crude jokes and innuendos around every corner and lots of satire about commercialism and consumerism.
Shouldn't you be on one of them escape transports?
Escape transports?
Newsflash, giant robots attacking! The escape transports are taking all the rich folks off this god-darn planet.
So why aren't you on one?
Socioeconomic disparity.
What?
He hasn't got enough bolts.
Most people that Ratchet & Clank ran into were mean or selfish, often forcing them to give up bolts in return for something to progress in the story.
And worst of all, he wants me to give you a prize for that ridiculous performance.
Cool, what is it?
I'm supposed to give you a swing shot, so you can sway to and fro like little insects.
All right, let's see it.
Not so fast. Today the 2 of you disgraced my obstacle course, so I am going to make you pay.
But that prize is ours from the captain. That's not fair.
Too bad, life's not fair.
The best of this material could be found in 2005's Ratchet Deadlocked, where the main antagonist was the head of an underground cable news and entertainment channel.
Time for some real action. It's time to blow it up!
He'd use heroes for marketing purposes, and then when they'd had their time, he'd get rid of them and move on to the next big thing. It was only when he kidnapped Ratchet and forced him to compete in the death games on Dreadzone did the audience stop buying what Vox was selling.
I just have one question for you. Okay, shoot. Would you like to buy an Ace Hardlight video game? How about an Ace Hardlight lunchbox? Action figures, movie rights, collectible trading cards? Ace Hardlight is the perfectly manufactured celebrity, straight from the presses of the Gleeman Vox Media empire. So tell me, why is it that I can't give this stuff away? Well, don't answer that.
Ratchet's genuine and caring nature won over the Dreadzone fans, and they were happy to get rid of Vox's selection of vain, selfish gladiators. As I discussed earlier, the movie tries to have a similar message, but fails miserably at trying to get that across, and most of the returning characters Ratchet & Clank run into in the retelling of their first adventure have been sanitized to an extent. All of them were a little more storybook, all in all being kinder, nicer people and lacking the selfish edge found in the original title. And some characters are dropped entirely in favor of new, paper-thin ones. The Galactic Rangers are made up of members Cora, Brax, and Alaris. I don't really think there's anything wrong with these characters, except on paper they resemble other more interesting characters from previous games that would have maybe been more welcome instead of these stand-ins. Why Alaris is a character that exists when Big Al is in the game is beyond me. And Cora could have easily been replaced by either Sasha Fyronix or Talon Apogee. Sasha would have made more sense and tied into the lore, being the head of the Galactic Rangers prior to Quark and Up Your Arsenal, but Cora shares a species with Talon from the PS3 Future Trilogy, not to mention the random Ranger grunts are just reskinned Kronks. Replace Brax with Zephyr, and you have a recognizable trio back. And this more kid-friendly writing doesn't just affect the characters either, it also affects the humor. The sense of humor the Ratchet games have had has always been one of the selling points for me, and each game usually had a pretty good range of laughs. Their simple sight gags, wordplay, the occasional crude joke, and of course the satirical nudges taken towards whatever Insomniac had in its crosshairs. While the remake does take some advantage of the modern landscape it was released into, most jokes are pretty easy and don't produce more than a chuckle as opposed to some of the belly laughs in other titles.
Up next, the comments section. How you can add meaning to your life by anonymously attacking people you've never met. Stay with us.
No problem. See you in the next reboot.
There isn't a hollow film, game, or online product launch she hasn't shredded in the comment section. You know, that kind of judgment takes real skill.
Even games that aren't as well regarded, such as the co-op-centric All for One, had plenty of witty writing and humor.
Dr. Frumpus Croyd, astrophysicist, paradoxologist, and Lombax Whisperer?
Well, it's been a lot of fun catching up, but I gotta bounce.
Not so fast, Nefarious. You've done some underhanded things in your time, but this beats all. I'm starting to think there may not even be an Intergalactic Tool of Justice award.
Ladies and gentlemen, your president.
Quark always manages to get a laugh out of me, though.
You're reckless, you're a loose cannon, and you're dangerous. That's my shtick.
But now the last laugh is on you.
Wait, what? That didn't make any sense.
Sure it did.
No, it didn't. It sounded like you were combining the joke is on you with I'll have the last laugh.
Take your pick.
My point is, if you're gonna use a one-liner, it should make sense and be relevant to the situation.
Look, I workshop thousands of these a year, and they can't all be gold. Now put your hands in the air.
Over your dead body.
Some say that the decline in the remake's writing is strictly because of the more kid-friendly nature and more optimistic tone it adopted. While I certainly think the lack of strong writing in the remake is a symptom of the more kid-friendly nature, I don't agree that the lack of strong writing is solely because of the more kid-friendly tone the film and game adopted. Good writing is good writing, no matter who the intended audience is. I think the same can be said for bad writing as well. A bad movie is a bad movie, no matter who the audience was supposed to be. The Ratchet & Clank movie has bad writing, which poisoned the game's remake writing as well. This is indisputable. However, I don't think it's a death blow to the franchise or a sign that the remake's writing is as good as it gets from here on out. From what I've seen of Rift Apart in trailers, it looks like Insomniac has crafted a story that gets at and understands the heart behind the main characters. Whether or not the humor will be up to par will probably be subjective, but at this point prior to its release, I feel pretty confident that Insomniac knows what they're doing. Going forward, I think the remake is going to be looked at as a failed experiment by many. I certainly do. It succeeded in some areas and failed in others, often making for a kind of meh experience, but one that's partially not its fault. I don't even want to know how many extra steps the developers had to go through in making the game while having to communicate with the people making the movie, especially if it was constantly being rewritten like it sounds like it was. I think there's a reason that the movie tie-in genre has fallen by the wayside in the last decade or so, and why so many of those games were considered to be just so-so. Insomniac on their own created unique and interesting stories for the Ratchet series for over a decade before the movie came out. And after the movie came out, they delivered what are probably the two best Spider-Man games to date, so I don't look at the way the Ratchet & Clank remake turned out and look at that as the norm for the series or for Insomniac games as a whole. It's an unfortunate exception to the rule, much in the way Fuse was for the studio. Remember that game? Of course you don't! It failed spectacularly in what seems to be partially due to EA's meddling. What a surprise there. To begin wrapping us up, what do I think the game is worth now? Originally, I said the game was worth its full $40 asking price, and I think I'm still there. With the recent markup of full-price games from $60 to $70, a nascent $40 really does feel like a budget price point. And that's exactly what the remake is, if you ask me. Since its release, it's been free with PlayStation Plus, been given away for free without PlayStation Plus as part of Sony's Play at Home initiative, and as part of the PlayStation Plus collection that's included for PS5 owners. Since the game is also 5 years old at this point, its price is probably constantly lowered due to sales, so if you're curious about the series and want a primer before Rift Apart, this isn't the worst way to introduce yourself to the series, and it should be pretty easy to do so. Just know that this game is probably on the lower side of the list of Ratchet games in terms of overall quality, which, honestly, actually probably says something about the series overall if you ask me. While it's in no way a bad game, I do think it's odd that game critics seem to give the game almost unanimous praise, but I don't necessarily blame them for thinking what they think. Many of the problems I've talked about in this video lie under the extremely polished surface of the gameplay, and if a critic had maybe never played a Ratchet title before, or it had been years since they had, I can understand them getting wowed by all the things the game does right. However, to longtime fans, I think this game will remain an odd blip on the radar and one that will probably be forgotten about in time, especially since the series appears to be getting back on track with Rift Apart. Time will tell how the game turns out, or even when the heck I'll get to play it, but if Insomniac's recent successes with the Spider-Man franchises are any indication, I think our favorite Lombax and his robot pal are in safe hands. Here's hoping for a new standout trilogy this gen to elevate Ratchet & Clank back up to where they belong with some of the greats.